I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, you are currently in France. All our viewers know that there are French strikes going on right now, strikes on the transport system. These strikes have not let up. They're the worst strikes since the 1980s, and they're running through the entire holiday season. So, Alexander, what's your sense as to what's going on in France right now and your feeling as to the strikes, and if you think they're going to let up, if you think they're going to continue? What's your take?
Right. I should first of all explain that I am in a alpine resort in Haute-Savoie in the French Alps. This isn't a area where you would expect to see obvious signs of industrial unrest. It's a place where people go for their holidays, their skiing holidays, which is why I am here. And of course, in order to get here, I drove through the French autoroutes, the French motorway system, which is, of course, controlled by tolls. So again, it's not the kind of place where you're likely to find big traffic jams because it's expensive to drive on French motorways. Only people, rarely, much less than in other countries, do people drive there. But you do hear people talk about strikes. And I've been speaking to a friend of mine in Paris. In fact, I've had several conversations with people in Paris. I've been hearing about situations in other parts of France, in the big cities, in Paris itself, and in other big cities. It is extremely different. And what is basically happening is that with the railway system largely shut down, with the metro system in Paris also to seriously affected, people feel much more restricted in how they can move, far more restricted in what they can buy. I mean, people are not running out of food exactly, but this is this time when people are supposed to be enjoying themselves and have a good time over Christmas. And it's turning into a very frugal Christmas for lots of people. But what is very interesting, what is really remarkable, is that the people that I've spoken to and the people I've heard from are not blaming the strikers. They are blaming Macron. They are very, very angry with the French government. And most of them support the strikes, despite the great inconvenience to their lives that these strikes are causing. And I think that really begs a number of questions of why that is. Firstly, what Macron is proposing to do, what has led to these strikes, is that he's proposing to carry out a radical reform of the French pension system. Now, there are actually some good arguments for doing that. The French pension system is extremely complicated. It's extremely generous for some workers. It is extremely unbalanced and not easy to get round. So it divides retired workers into winners and losers. And it's a massive burden on the French economy and explains why the tax system is so high and so burdensome for so many people in France. Nonetheless, it is these reforms of the pension system which have canalized, which have stimulated an awful lot of the protests. And I think the reason again is multiple fold. Firstly, it always seems to people in France, or to many people in France, that what Macron is doing is that he is consistently making decisions which hit ordinary people, in this case, ordinary people through their pensions, most, instead of going after the very, very rich and people, the vast oligarchs of wealth, if you like, focused in Paris and in another few places, who are doing disproportionately well out of the system as it exists in France now. And the second thing is that one has to add to this a general sense with Macron that he is not ultimately very interested in France itself, that the reason he wants to reform France in this way is that he wants to make France more like Britain or the United States economically. He also wants to impress the Germans and win over favourable views for himself in Germany amongst people who share in Germany and other places his big reform program, and that ultimately these reforms are being carried out by Macron in order to leverage his position, in order to make put himself in an even stronger position as he tries to replace Merkel as the leader of the European Union. So he's pitching, in other words, to lead the European Union rather than to change France for the better. And one of the things I've noticed, and which is different, and it's a thing I've noticed in several places, until a few years ago, you used to see in France outside, not just public buildings, but lots of buildings, you used to see the French flag, the tricolour, and next to it would be the flag of the European Union. You see that far less nowadays. You see the tricolour everywhere, the flag of the European Union far less so. You still see it outside some official buildings, not all of them, but the tricolour has completely overtaken it. And I suspect that reflects the actual sentiments of the French.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Alexander, that it's not only anger towards Macron, it's anger towards the entire EU Brussels construct. So, I mean, the two are almost synonymous, Macron and the EU. You can't really separate the two, and the French seem to be expressing that sentiment. The strike started, Alexander, on December 5th. This is not unusual for France, we need to say. There was a 22-day strike in the winter of 1995. That was when Jacques Chirac was president, and that was against welfare cutbacks. And the longest transport strike in France lasted 28 days, and that was also over Christmas, and that was in 1986 and early 1987. So it seems that the strikes generally take place during the holiday season, these types of transport strikes. It's not unusual in France to have these types of protests. But what do you think makes these strikes particularly different than strikes in the past? Is it the yellow vest dynamic that, we still have that kind of going on, not to the extent that it was? Is it the fact that you're looking at Macron and EU and the strikes kind of, like I said earlier, are a rebuttal against Macron and the EU rule over France? What makes these strikes different?
Well, what makes them different is that they have popular support behind them. I mean, in other situations where we've had strikes in France, our French society has been polarized. I mean, the strikers have had some support, and they've also been opposed by many people. On this occasion, I get the sense that many more people in France support the strikes. And I don't mean this in terms of, opinion poll numbers. I mean in terms of depth of feeling, which is always very difficult to measure statistically, but where people before had been willing, to support strikes because, well, French people, as you rightly say, they have an insurrectionary tradition. This isn't something so unusual for them. On this occasion, there is a much deeper anger within French society about the way about the general situation and about the general condition of France. There is a sense here, I think there is a sense amongst a lot of people in France, that you have a president who doesn't really care about France, isn't ultimately very interested in France as such. He's very interested in himself. He's very interested in pleasing his smart friends in Berlin and Brussels and Washington and New York and London. And he's prepared to sacrifice the interests of the French in order to basically ingratiate himself with those smart friends and to establish himself as a leader amongst them. It's almost as if he's being macho against his own people in order to, impress, well, let's be, crude about it, the bankers in New York and Brussels and Frankfurt, rather than, as I said, stand up for the people against those same bankers. And not just the bankers, of course, industrial groups, all the usual people that constitute the international oligarchy of elitism and wealth that we have today. So that, the Davos crowd, in other words. So this is, I think, what I think a lot of people in France are feeling. And I'm going to make a prediction. I don't know how these strikes are going to end. I don't know whether Macron is going to make any significant concessions. But one way or the other, and I've been saying this for over a year, I don't expect the situation to get better. I don't expect strike action and protests to go away. There has been a massive attempt, as we know, by the French state to crush the Gilets jaunes protests. There's been a media blackout about them, and yet those protests have gone on and on. And I've heard a story, I haven't seen this myself, that if you travel around on not the autoroute, the motorways, but the ordinary route nationale, the ordinary roads in France, you see yellow vest protesters often at junctions and crossroads and roundabouts and all those sort of things, which you don't, they're not invisible to the French people. Those protests have still been going on, and they've been going on now for over a year. Now they've been joined by industrial protests, by large numbers of French workers. I predict that this is going to continue and get worse and grow greater. Bear in mind that in some respects, economically, France has actually been doing slightly better this year, not because the underlying conditions in France are better, but because Macron increased spending to basically buy off the yellow vests and end the protests. He's not going to be able to continue doing that indefinitely. And at some point, I expect the protests will grow.
All right, let's examine that a little bit deeper, Alexander, because Macron is doing what I think a Macron type of person does. He's a banker. He's part of the Davos crowd. He's going to protect his people, the people that he, answers to, the people that control him, and the people that he's a part of. So I don't think it's any surprise that Macron is doing what Macron was put in place to do. Now, given the French voted Macron into office, so, it would be surprising to me if the people that voted Macron didn't see this coming. I understand there was a large portion of the population that was for Le Pen or that were for other candidates that didn't follow Macron's neoliberal globalist outlook, but still Macron did win, and he is the president of France, like it or not. Are these strikes more than pension reform, more than the fuel tax that the yellow vests were about? Are these strikes essentially, because we also put the connection between Macron and the EU, are these strikes really about the destruction of what it means to be French and what France has traditionally represented to its people, to Europe, and to the world? Because Macron is, in essence, looking to destroy the French state. He's looking to create this EU superstate.
Yes.
I mean, you said he could get, just to finish off my line of thinking, what you said really struck a chord with me, that he tried to buy off the yellow vests, and they haven't disappeared, but maybe you could say they calmed down a little. They dissipated a little. Of course, you could say that Macron took a very heavy-handed tactic against the yellow vests. He clamped down on them with, military action and police action as well, with the media blackout. But it sounds to me that you're saying Macron may be able to, plug a couple of holes up, but, the dam's going to burst sooner or later.
Yes. Let's just discuss his election victory, because I think this is an important point, actually. It explains a lot of the problems in France at the moment, because, yes, he undoubtedly did win an election victory, and that election victory was, properly counted. I've no reason to doubt that the numbers are as were published. I mean, I know that there are some people who dispute this, but I have no doubt that he did win an election victory against Marine Le Pen, which was, up to a certain point above board. But it was very highly leveraged and manipulated. In the run-up to that election, the universal expectation in France was that the leader, the person who would be the most likely person to come forward and who would lead France, was François Fillon. Now, François Fillon had a lot of support amongst precisely the kind of people in, if you like, the French countryside that Macron doesn't have. But he was brought down by what I think many people in France see as a very manipulated expenses scandal. In other words, all French politicians fake their expenses. Fillon was no different, but it was used against him to stop him running. And after Fillon was sort of knocked off the race, Macron was brought forward as this outsider, this person, this anti-establishment figure who was going to sort of break with the past. And Macron was never an anti-establishment figure. He was the most establishment of all the political leaders of France. But he was built up in this way in order to win a presidential election where, as I said, the French elite essentially arranged it that it would be between him and Marine Le Pen. And Marine Le Pen, one has to say this, in France, comes along with a lot of very difficult political baggage. I mean, she's still perceived by far too many people in France to help her win an election as an ultra-rightist in a way that makes it very difficult, still, I think, for her to win outright a French election. But the key point to understand is that it wasn't a vote for Macron, a positive vote for Macron, and it was certainly not a vote for the kind of program that Macron, as president of France, has been trying to implement. What he wants to do, and I think you've described it very well, he wants to create a European superstate. He perceives himself as the president and leader of that state, or at least, if not the president, certainly the leader of that state. And he is leveraging French power and France's position in order to achieve that. So a lot of French people feel, yes, very angry about France being subsumed into the greater Europe of Macron's imagination. And let us never forget that nationalism, modern nationalism, not only has very deep roots in France, but in a sense, it began here. It was a product, if you like, of the French Revolution, when the French nation, as it was called, rebelled against the king and established the French Republic, which was for the French people. I mean, that's very much part of the political tradition and thinking here. So there's always been a French nationalist tradition, very strong one. But on top of all of that, I think a lot of people in France sense that Macron is using them. Just as he's using France to leverage himself up in Europe, he is using the French. He is, hurting the French in order to make himself a stronger player in Berlin and Brussels and Frankfurt. And of course, a lot of people in France don't like that and are very angry about it. And I think that does go to a lot of the depth of anger that people feel about what Macron is doing.
Yeah, I mean, France to me is representative of the struggle going on in the UK with Brexit, in the US now with Trump. Maybe, you could take places like Hungary, places like Poland, where it's that constant struggle between the globalist elite,
yes,
and the people, and the nation state type of movement. Some people say
Yeah.
the nationalist state, the nationalist movement. I say the nation statism. There's that struggle in some places like Hungary, for example. You see Orban winning out, who's, a Hungary for Hungarians. But in places, like the UK, there was a 3-year struggle to achieve that sovereignty. And in France, you're seeing kind of the reverse, but the people are not giving up.
Oh,
I mean,
no.
this is the same formula playing out over and over again. In Canada, for example, once again, you saw the election of Trudeau, but the people in Canada still are not giving up. They still want their country back, so to speak, in a way. I mean, I'm simplifying,
Yes.
the struggle here, but that's the essence of what you're seeing. And France is another example of that.
Well, can I just cite again the famous slogan that was used during the Brexit referendum in Britain in 2016, which was "Take back control." The idea is not to have important decisions about your life and the way you live your life taken by anonymous forces which you have no control over, but to bring them back under control into your own country where they're accountable to you through democratic institutions. This is, by the way, a major point I want to make. I think there's a very widespread mythology that a lot of these movements are somehow, populist. I think you have to understand that there's a very high element of democratic sentiment behind this. The idea being you have a president and a parliament and a government in Paris, if you're French, which is accountable to you as the French people, not accountable to Brussels, Berlin, Frankfurt, and Washington. It is very much, I think, that kind of sentiment. And it's a very powerful sentiment in France. And I think, obviously, it's one which, with globalization, with the whole process of globalization, which, to be very clear, it is an entirely elite, financialized phenomenon. It's not one that's worked very well, in fact, worked at all well for ordinary people in places like Britain or France or Hungary or even Germany, increasingly, or the United States. It's the sense that these people have that they want to take back control into the familiar institutions that once worked for them and which they themselves can hold accountable to themselves through the ballot box. It has, as I said, a very important democratic dimension, which I think is being overlooked. All this talk about populism, I think, is very, very misleading. But can I also say a few other things, which is, of course, that adding to all of this, in France specifically, there has been for a long time now a very deep sense of economic malaise. This is an extremely rich country. Living standards for many people in France are very high. But the economy has been stuttering along for a very long time. The tax burden is too high. The euro has not been good for France at all. It's been stuck in a kind of economic cul-de-sac, if you like, which has not worked very well for it, and which is also, I think, firing up people in the French countryside, in the small towns, increasingly in what is, what are left of French factories. There's been a certain amount of deindustrialization here, not on the scale of Britain. But this is what is bringing all these feelings together, a sense that we've lost control. We don't have leaders who are accountable to us. Macron isn't interested in us anymore. We want to bring government back to France, to Paris, which is accountable to us again. We want to be French also because we are very proud of our culture and our history and our traditions as French people. We have a very long history. We want that too. And at the same time, we have this deep feeling that the economy isn't doing very, very well, and that the benefits are not being equally shared, and that they're going disproportionately to a very small number of incredibly wealthy people, many of them, by the way, not French. You know, they may be bankers in New York or London or Washington or Paris or Frankfurt or wherever, but not necessarily French. Some of them are. And at the same time, these people, supported by this great Praetorian Guard within France, of all these people who are the products of the great French graduate schools that churn out administrators, like the École Nationale d'Administration, for example, or these great, écoles, the grandes écoles that produce this technocracy, which is increasingly serving the interests of the powerful and the globally wealthy, rather than the French people themselves. So all of this is coming together, and it's coming together especially strongly in France. It's going to be a bigger battle than in Britain, much longer battle, because France is so much more deeply embedded into the European institutions, because France was, we must never forget this, one of the states that originally set up the European Union. It was one of the original six. In fact, you could argue that the European Union, in its origins, was a deal between the French and the Germans in order to sort of stabilize Europe. That was the idea back in the 50s. Of course, it's evolved into something much different from that. But it's going to take a long, long time for the French to break free, if they ever do.
I think you hit it. You hit it out of the park with that one. I totally agree, Alexander. I think and we'll finish off on this thought if you have any further comments. Yes. I think the globalists, the elitists, whether you're looking at Macron or Trudeau or Merkel or all these people, I think they miscalculated how much people truly love their country and they'll fight for their country. I think that's that's when you get to the essence of it. Like you said, the French just want France back. They just want to feel like they're French again. And the same can go for Canadians, the same can go for Germans and Irish and all across the board. Greeks, people want their country back. They want to feel that sense of pride and participation and accountability in their government. I mean, it's so simplistic to say this, but that's the overall sentiment that's spreading all over the world right now.
If you're talking about a small French town, they want someone in Paris who cares about whether or not they have good schools, whether or not they have good transport links, whether or not the healthcare system works, whether or not the post system works. They want, and they want jobs and they want welfare, because people want those things everywhere. But they want a government in France that works for them, for the French people. They don't want a government in France, a government in Paris, that is more interested in what Brussels and Frankfurt thinks than what people in Bordeaux or Lyon, or dare I say, or Savoie, where I am now, think. That's, I think, where that's what underpins this whole phenomenon. And as I said, in France, I predict it's going to get stronger. As I said, I thought the Gilets jaunes protests would continue through 2019, and they did. As I said, I did not expect that Macron would be able to keep the lid on them as successfully as he still has, because, as I say, through a combination of very tough police action and some loosening of the fiscal screws, which have made life just a fractionally easier for people. But it's not resolved the underlying problems. It's only bought a very little time, which Macron is not able to use, because Macron can't unbecome Macron. He is what he is. He's trying at various times, to pretend that he's the new Charles de Gaulle. But de Gaulle was first and foremost, and above all else, someone who stood for France. That's not what Macron is. Macron can't just change what he is, and that's impossible to expect of him. So given that that is so, the protests will grow. The political system in France makes it very difficult, as you rightly touched on, for an incumbent president to be leveraged out of office or to be forced into changing policies. It's almost a quasi-monarchical system that they have here under the sort of, the appearance of republicanism. So it's very difficult to see how, there can be a breakthrough in any short term. But it is the immovable force of Macron facing the immovable obstacle of the force of Macron facing what I suspect will become an increasingly irresistible force from the French people. We will see how this plays out, but I intend to be coming to France more regularly. I haven't been doing so for a long time, and I'm going to try to reacquaint myself more closely with the situation here, and I'm intending to visit Paris fairly soon.
All right, we'll leave it there. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you very much, guys. If you like this video, click on the subscribe button down below. Click on the notifications bell to make sure you get notifications every time we publish a new video. Look for us on iTunes and on Soundcloud to get an audio podcast of this video as well. And we post all our videos on BitChute and on duranvideo.com. So look for our videos there on those two platforms as well. And please donate to us on PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. Your donation means a lot to us, and it really helps keep this channel going. And to stay in touch with everything going on in the Duran community, download the Telegram app and subscribe to our channel there. And you'll be kept up to date with everything that's going on, including our DRN20 discount, which is still running, 20% off all merchandise. And that includes our 2 new ebooks that we've put on the Duran shop, which one of them touches on Ukraine Gate and the other one on the Epstein saga. Alexander, 2 new ebooks.
Indeed, 2 case studies of elite malpractice. I mean, if we turn to Epstein first, I mean, the only way to understand the Epstein scandal is as a scandal of the elite. I mean, and not just of the American elite, but of course of the global elite, because the thing that came across very obviously about Epstein is that this is a man with global connections. He obviously, he's based, as we all know, in the United States. He was supposedly a financier in New York, so nobody really knows how he made his money. But of course, he had connections, with very strong connections, as we've now discovered, with Britain. One of his closest associates, Ghislaine Maxwell, is British. The scandal has come and is affecting Britain itself, with a member of the royal family, Prince Andrew, involved. But Britain is not the only country where Epstein had business or was involved in. He had a very, very swanky apartment in Paris. So he had connections with the French elite, which we've just been talking about. He had connections to Israel, and there's been lots of stories about that. He had connections to Saudi Arabia, where he claimed residence. And he was even the holder of a fake Australian passport. All very interesting and very confusing and very unexplained, but clearly someone who, as I said, belongs to this global elite that we are talking about. And we see in Epstein certain interesting qualities of this elite. Firstly, its sense of complete immunity and unaccountability. I mean, Epstein was able to carry out all these extraordinary crimes that he did in full public view. So he had people like Bill and Hillary Clinton coming along. He had people like Alan Dershowitz coming along. He had all sorts of other people. And he had all these glamorous parties, and all these victims were there. And supposedly nobody saw anything, which I don't believe, by the way. And nothing happened. So this enormous sense of privilege and power and lack of accountability and a sense that you can do anything you basically like. If you're rich enough and powerful enough, you can get away with it. And the other thing that is so interesting about the Epstein case is consider the nature of his victims. You know, these are not rich, powerful people. These are girls, mainly lower class girls from local schools, easily enticed into his world, subject to appalling abuse. And again, one senses an elite that really doesn't care about such people anymore, that isn't interested in them, that sees them essentially as objects to be exploited or manipulated or mistreated or abused, rather than as human beings with rights like everyone else's rights. So in this book, we talked about Epstein, we talk about the mysteries that surround the man, the fact that there's so little known still about him, this extraordinary carapace of protection that encircled him, the continuing mysteries about his death, even that isn't been fully or properly explained. We look at the various interconnections we had. And as I said, we talk mainly and principally, I think, about not just Epstein himself, but about the world in which he functioned. And in our other book, that's also a book about yet another elite scandal, because we talk about the globalized elite, but you know, we were talking in this video about the technocrats who sustain Macron in power. In France, we've seen a similar sort of technocrats in power in Washington. We saw them all operating round the clock during Russiagate, when the Trump campaign was put under massive surveillance because Donald Trump was seen as somebody who might threaten the position of that elite. And now we saw them all coming along as witnesses in the Ukraine-gate drama, people like, you know, ambassadors and State Department officials and anonymous whistleblowers and all of those people. And again, it's so obviously, to my way of thinking, an elite conspiracy against someone who is seen in some way, shape or form to be a threat to that elite. And in this book, we also discuss at considerable length how thin the whole case of Ukraine-gate, actually is. So 2 books about very similar topics, and very similar topics to the ones that we've discussed on this video. Of course, we're not only selling ebooks, we're also selling all our other things like the magic mugs that we always have. I think I saw Alex drinking from his. My wife has hers, but it's on the slopes at the moment where she's on the mountain, so I don't have it next to me. But Alex has his magic mugs there. I am wearing my marvelous Duran long-sleeved t-shirt. It's minus sub-zero temperatures some of the time, not all of the time, even when it's very bright as it is at the moment. So you need nice warm clothes like this beautiful 100% cotton shirt, which you can wear then. And of course, in the evenings, I've got all my polo shirts when I go to the various restaurants and those places. So wonderful things you can buy in our shop. DRN20, as Alex said, is the discount code. You can buy our books, you can buy our products. It's still the Christmas, New Year holiday season. You can buy all these things for yourself, for your friends. DRN20, Alex will tell you how.
Go to the Duran shop.com and put the discount code DRN20 there to get a 20% discount off all merchandise. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Until next time, everybody, take care.